All right, so the last thing we want to take a look at here at the North is the philosophies and the way that the Northern culture changed as a result of the embrace that took place with technology. We talked about how during this antebellum period, the North is going to embrace the Industrial Revolution while the South rejects it as un-American. And so we talked about how as the Northern population grew, more cities were developed that created more industry, created more jobs, more immigration came there, which created a much more diverse culture. We talked about how transportation changed and revolutionized as you go from turnpikes to canals, and ultimately railroads had a bigger impact than any other form of transportation. We also took a look at how the telegraph system evolves with the railroads and interconnects every town. And the Associated Press is going to connect considerably more towns in the North than in the South, leading to newspapers and a sense of connected, informed public in the North that you don't see happen in the South. Lastly, yesterday we took a look at the cultural changes that happened as a result, particularly in places like upstate New York and Massachusetts, where people were embracing new philosophies, and it became so common that they gave the nickname the burned over district to New York because they were so willing to accept any new ideas that they were constantly getting on fire with new ideas. And we talked about how it was typical to see movements like the Oneida, where everybody was married to everybody else and the children were literally raised by the community. We talked about the Brook Farm experiment and how Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote the Scarlet Letter as a reaction to what happens whenever you isolate yourself from society, like they did on their communal farm, where they were sharing all the chores and sharing all the property. And where we left off yesterday, we talked about how no movement perhaps demonstrated more the way that Northerners were willing to embrace these new cultures than the Mormon faith that was created during this period of time. And we talked about how the Mormons might be a very good example of this because it's an example that you've heard of before. The Mormon faith still exists today. But if you look back at the origins of the Mormon faith, with Joseph Smith and the Catskill Mountains and the story, and from today with a hindsight looking at from hundreds of years back, you look at how the motivations behind Joseph Smith's story very well might have been more to try to convince people to give him their money and engage in his way of life. And then to keep his society rolling, he had to move those people out of upstate New York before they embraced the next big thing. And so that's why today we see most of those Mormons that were led across the desert by Brigham Young later on after Joseph Smith died. That Mormon faith settles so far out west, settles so far out in those mountains around Salt Lake City that that's how they were willing to survive. Whereas other movements like the Oneida and the Brook Farm experiment all died out up here in Northeast. The Mormons didn't. Now, to take a look at, lastly, as we see the North embracing a lot of this stuff, you see some of the greatest literature in the history of the United States start to emerge. These schools of thought that Americans start to embrace in universities and schools. Once again, where are most of the universities? They're in the North. Where are all the people that are gathering to share these ideas? They're in the North. Where is all of this going to be embraced? With the cultural diversity in the North. So, for example, a movement like the Romanticism, where people start to embrace these new philosophies, Romantics would have believed that man is born good. And when you have a baby that is born brand new, that baby symbolizes the goodness of God, according to Romantics, in the way that the world is supposed to be. But Romantics believe that as time goes on, that child is going to be corrupted by society. And so what Romantics believe is that people are by nature good, but they are corrupted by an evil society. Now, this is the type of philosophy that somebody who's in the North, who's embracing all this education and these new ideas, they're going to really adopt and really go after some of these new ideas, whereas people in the South are going to reject this. So, for example, In the arts, we take a look at the Hudson River School, was a group of New York painters who found inspiration in wildlife that had been untouched by mankind. This represents the ideas behind Romanticism. If you believe that people are born naturally good and society corrupts them, well then in nature, if you find yourself scenes that human eyes have not touched or human hands have not corrupted, that is the way God intended it. So early on, the Hudson River School would have embraced upstate New York. Once again, the burned over districts. So you see these early romantic painters. Thomas Cole paints the picture Morning on the Hudson River. And you see the idea of a pristine virgin forest that has not been touched by human hands it shows you the beauty of nature before society corrupts it. Asher Durand, Into the Woods. Here's another example of a painting that demonstrates some of these ideas behind the Hudson River School. This one's perhaps my favorite, Frederick Church, Niagara Falls from the American side. I like this painting perhaps better than the others with all the different shades of blue and the colors in there. Once again, the idea behind this is you're reflecting the idea that nature is wonderful, nature is innocent, nature is beautiful. It's corrupted by society. Now, as upstate New York slowly becomes more populated, this starts to influence the philosophy of those romantics. So later romantics are not going to focus on the Hudson River as much as they're going to move out west to look for new frontier ideas. So for example, some of the later romantics would focus on painting the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone, places out west where nobody had touched before. In the same vein, romantic writers are going to reflect some of the literature of the time that is going to really embrace what the philosophies of people up in the Northeast. So for example, James Fenimore Cooper writes one of my favorite stories, my favorite movies of all time, The Last of the Mohicans, was a collection of stories, the leather stocking tales. Most of James Fenimore Cooper's stories would revolve around the idea of Native Americans and Indians on the frontier. The idea that these Indians live closer to earth. They're not corrupted by modern societies like we are and like Europeans are, which would make them the noble savages that makes them somewhat better and more in tune with nature than we are. Romantic writers like Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is considered a romantic, one of the greatest poets in American history. Wrote The Leaves of Grass. A lot of people believe that a lot of the inspiration behind Walt Whitman's philosophy and his writing revolve around being a gay man who was living in New York at the time and being forced to repress his natural urges by a society that is corrupted. Once again, reflects a lot of what the Romantics believed at the time. Another one of the most popular books ever written in American history, Moby Dick, written by Herman Melville. Now here's an interesting figure. Herman Melville ran off when he was a teenager to get a job working on a whaling ship, whaling for whale oil to fuel the growing energy industry in the United States. And when he returns, he writes these stories about tales at sea. The most famous of which is Moby Dick. Now when you take a look at this, Herman Melville is once again another example of these romantic writers. Not necessarily writing romantics about the idea of love and that stuff that people would think of today, but the idea of being nature and natural society gone wild. So for example, in Moby Dick, Herman Melville is reflecting the dangers of what can happen to human society or human nature if it's left unchecked and gone wild. So for example, in the book Moby Dick, when Captain Ahab has his obsession with the whale, the white whale Moby Dick, to get revenge for losing his leg, he's willing to risk everything, even the lives of his crew, to get revenge with that whale for having lost his leg. And in the end, they lose everything because of Captain Ahab's human nature gone mad. But perhaps no romantic writer had a larger impact, not just here in the United States, but became famous all over the world than Edgar Allan Poe. He's perhaps the most famous of these romantic writers and perhaps had a larger impact. He's one of the only writers here in America that Europeans tried to emulate. For the most part, many of these new movements Europeans saw the Americans as trying to copy something they had already done. Edgar Allan Poe was the first one that did something genuinely new that caught the attention of Europeans. Personally, I find him to be kind of creepy. Even the picture there kind of gives me a little bit of the willies there. And I know while some people love Edgar Allan Poe stories, The Telltale Heart, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Cask of Amontillado, all of it just kind of creeps me out. Everything about his story seems a little bit, even his life in the mysterious ways about his death, all is just kind of creepy. But he's perhaps the most famous and most influential of these romantic writers. As you see American society in the North evolve over time, you see those romantics evolve into a new movement, transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, these are people who believe that yes, humans are born perfect. And yes, society corrupts them. But if you're a transcendentalist, you believe that humans are capable of transcending and rising above that corrupt society. And so we see these transcendentalist writers, the two most famous of which are Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's the first real American leader. He's a philosophical, intellectual leader that people across the country embrace. And he's proving that he's preaching the idea of a superior American culture. We don't need to try to emulate or live up to the Europeans because we're already better than them. On the other side, a friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson's, who's from the same town as him, Henry David Thoreau, also becomes one of the anthems of transcendentalism with his Walden Pond, where he believed that you could achieve the ideal way of life by separating yourself from society and society's troubles, and he lived for a year in solitude on Walden Pond up there simply writing. The reason we bring up some of these people is, once again, I mentioned yesterday, you look at some of those philosophical movements and they seem sort of like, when you talk about Brook Farm and the Oneida people, they seem like those free love, hippie 1960s, 70s types of movements. Well, the reason we bring that up is because a lot of those movements from the 1960s and 70s got their inspiration from these people. In fact, Martin Luther King got most of the ideas behind the civil rights movement of the 1960s and civil disobedience and peaceful disobedience against society by reading Henry David Thoreau. And it was Henry David Thoreau who was willing to go to jail in the 1850s, because he refused to pay taxes to a government that supported slavery. These are ideas that are going to reverberate through American history and influence all these other things. Now, why do I bring all this up? Why do I bring up the Oneida? Why do I bring up Brook Farm? Why do I bring up the Mormons? Why do I bring up romantics and all the romantic painters and the romantic philosophers and transcendentalists and Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman and Herman Melville and all of them? Why do we bring this up? To demonstrate the fact that it's the people of the North who are willing to embrace these new movements. People in the South reject it all. And perhaps no movement has a bigger impact during this period of time than the abolition movement. If people in the North are willing to embrace these ideas behind romantics, if they're willing to embrace Mormonism, then wouldn't it stand to reason that they're also going to embrace movements like abolitionism? And the idea that slavery is an institution that probably needs to go. If you're a transcendentalist, if you are a romantic, this falls squarely in line with your philosophy. Humans are born good, society corrupts them. Human nature is a good thing, slavery is a societal issue that's corrupting them. Now, as time went on, the abolition movement is going to evolve. Early abolitionists felt the United States should get rid of the institution simply because it made us look bad. Early abolitionists said, if you look around the world, the only countries that still involve themselves with slavery are third world countries. America's no longer a third world country. We're an industrialized nation. We should start acting like one. We should get rid of slavery. Early abolitionists said we should get rid of slavery because it makes America look bad. As time grows, and just like the burned over district in upstate New York evolves, so does the abolition movement. William Lloyd Garrison is going to be the first one who comes out and steps out and says, no, we should get rid of slavery not because it makes us look bad, but because it is bad. William Lloyd Garrison will take his movement to such extremes that he at one point in time said the Constitution of the United States is a pact with the devil forged in hell. And until the United States got rid of slavery, we were going to be a tortured, tormented nation. Perhaps nobody gives more wings to the abolition movement than Frederick Douglass, a former slave himself, who was able to run away from Maryland up to the north through the Underground Railroad, eventually educated himself, fell in with the right group of people that they were able to move him across the ocean over to England, where he received an Oxford education. When Frederick Douglass returns back here to the United States, he is able to eloquently give a good documentation of what it was like to be a slave. And anybody who, later on when we discuss this, the last part of this chapter, people who argued that slaves were not capable of more, couldn't explain to us Frederick Douglass. If slaves aren't capable of doing more, then explain to me this guy who was a former slave with an Oxford education who can eloquently describe his experiences better than most white people. And lastly, the abolition movement and the romantic writers and the education and the movements of the North will ultimately result in the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, a fictional book about slavery that rocked the nation. And as the book Uncle Tom's Cabin spread across the country and the evil villain Simon the Greek kills Uncle Tom at the end of the book, the American people are outraged by the atrocities that they see in the book, and it starts to get Americans, particularly in the North, embracing the idea that slavery needs to go. Here's the irony about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the book, had never been to a plantation. The entire book was a fictionalized idea that she had come across through second and third hand accounts that she had read or talked to people who had been to plantations, but she had personally never been to one herself. Nonetheless, the abolition movement was growing. Now, as we make our way towards the Civil War here, it's important to remember that the abolition movement was a minority. It was never a majority of people in the North. In fact, most Northerners saw the abolition movement as dangerous. But it was a growing minority. And it was a minority that was gaining influence. And as more and more Northerners were willing to accept these new ideas like transcendentalism, romanticism, Mormonism, the Oneida culture, Brook Farm, and all that stuff, they were also embracing abolition.